My name is Ensiyah, and you're watching Social Chai with Ensiyah.
Right. Hi, everybody. My name is Ensiyah. Welcome to this new show called Social Chai. We're going to be talking about social issues, global issues, everything under the sun. Today, I have a very special guest with me to discuss our first topic for the first episode, which is racism. The guest is Jermaine McKenzie. But before he comes in and we start our discussion, we are going to be listening to a song of his called I Can't Breathe, which is really, really cool. So let's go check that out.
I don't want to be here because God has cursed me to see what life should be like.
Black skin on the cold concrete. It ain't my bed, but this is my street. Now as they lay me down to sleep, and other black men killed by police. If I should die before you wake, don't take my death as just another mistake. Just before my soul depart, I write this song with a broken heart. This black skin must really be a curse. The racism gets worse and worse. The cop car has become the new hearse. Society more upset because I curse than a little black child afflicted by this racial curse. What's worse? I think about how it all began, the hatred towards the black man, and why the color of my skin became my sin. Can somebody just help me sing? Some say it's capitalism and slavery. Some say it's the religion that made me the target of all this hate and envy. Or is it time to fight back like Rev Avery? Brothers, it's time to show some bravery.
So that was I Can't Breathe by Jermaine McKenzie. You can find that on all platforms. You can find that on Spotify, on YouTube. So stream that. Really cool song. It's got a really strong message. Let's have Jermaine join us. Hi, Jermaine.
Hello, Ensiyah. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing lovely. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for coming. So do you want to give like a quick introduction to who you are, what you do, just for people who might not know you?
Okay, so my birth name is Jermaine McKenzie. My stage name right now is MC Zanj. It might change at some point, but we'll wait and see. But I'm originally from Jamaica. I spent a few years studying in the US. I did my first 2 degrees there in political science and history. But I'm living in Canada now for the last decade. I came here initially for university, and I pursued a degree in Mandarin and education. So now I'm a teacher, and earlier this year, I think in January, I started writing songs after a lesson that I had with some of my students. So I've always had a passion for singing, but it was actually a lesson with my students that this renewed interest and made me decide to start sharing my music with everyone else. And so this song that you just played, I Can't Breathe, that's the first single that I just released. And of course, it's a very emotional song, and a song that speaks to the political climate that we see in the US, but across other countries as well, dealing with racism at this time.
Right. So the topic for today is essentially racism. That's what we're here to talk about. And there is a lyric in your song which is very specific about it, how it says,
Yeah.
I think about it, how it all began, the hatred towards the black man. So
Yes.
can you maybe
Yeah.
like shed some light on that? Like, how do you think hatred towards the black man and the history of racism began, and how it is connected to why it persists today still in society?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important question, and it's something that has definitely pricked my mind for a very long time. And as a person who has always been interested in history, I've taken time to really delve into racism and to understand how is it that people can fill their heart with such hatred towards somebody that they don't even know just by the appearance of their complexion. It's incredibly fascinating, as it is ridiculous. But when you go back into the history, you start to understand how people are this way. And so, from my readings and from my point of view, I think we have to go back very far in time to really look at how this hatred all began. Racism as we know it today really started in and around, I want to say, after the slave trade began. Well, the Western slave trade began in around the late 1400s, right? And there was a need to create some ideology in order to support the mistreatment of people of African descent who were now being enslaved. And so you find during that time that a lot of theories supporting white supremacy, started popping up. But prior to that, there was definitely issues with race, but it was less racially specific and probably more driven by ethnocentricity, right? Because people have always recognized that there were differences in complexion, right? But in terms of just labeling a person because of their complexion, and giving them certain characteristics, that is, as I said, relatively recent, right, in the last 500 years with Western slavery. But we also have to look back further into history to look at the relationship between Africa and other countries or other regions, right? I think a lot of people, if we go back in time, they look at the Arab slave trade, for instance, right? And people look at that relationship, and some people attribute, as I said, these characteristics to dark-skinned people because of the history of that. But if you look at it in its totality, you've had slavery associated with pretty much every complexion and almost every culture, right? Whether it's people who identify as Caucasians, whether it's people who identify as Asians, or Arabs, different people have been used as slaves throughout history. But there is definitely something to be said about why is it that even after understanding that part of history, why is it that the hatred and the anti-blackness still resonates so strongly even today? And I think a large part of it is because of the way history is taught, right? And I think a lot of people are unaware of the great civilizations that existed in Africa, long before any other region, and also the contributions that those civilizations made to other civilizations, whether it's the Nubian empire, whether it's Kush, whether it's ancient Egypt, all the contributions that these great civilizations made to human development. A lot of times when people talk about ancient Egypt, they almost talk about it as if it's not a part of Africa. And also as if, the funny thing about it, Egypt isn't the first great African civilization, right? There are other civilizations that even predate Egypt that influenced Egypt. So I think a lot of the issues with racism is a lack of understanding of history and how misinterpreted and misconstrued history has been perpetuated over time, that people start to associate blackness with inferiority because of the fact that they don't know and understand human history.
Right. Do you think maybe it persists also because, like you talked about the narrative, right? It's kind
Mhm.
of almost been erased. So do you think it's because Caucasians or like imperialists and
Mhm.
colonizers, kind of defined the narrative with the spread of English all over the world, and they kind of wrote our history? So at this point, the history that's taught, especially in America, I feel like
Yeah.
if you go into any social studies class, right? All
Mhm.
the civilizations that you talked about, all the history you talked about is kind of almost glossed over rather than
Yeah.
really analyzed or paid attention to.
Definitely, definitely. I think that there's an issue with how that history is taught, or how much of that history is purposefully neglected, right? And not looked at. And it's very rich and it's very fascinating. And I say for the last few years, I've really been delving deeply into ancient African history. And it's quite a bit of work because so much of it has been whitewashed, or so much of it has been looked over for such a long time, or ignored purposefully, that you really have to be intentional in your search to find the information. But I also think that there is another aspect to racism and why it persists, especially, as I said, after the late 1400s, when the slave trade began, or the Western slave trade began, right? And that's the economic element, right? It's the economic element. I remember when I first came across this book by Dr. Eric Williams when I was in grade 12. It's called Capitalism and Slavery. And so it's a very voluminous book. It's a very big book with lots of detail, very, very well researched. And he wrote about how when the plantation society started in the Caribbean, right, that initially it was Irish and Scottish laborers that were being brought in to work on the plantations, right? And initially they had used the native peoples of the region, right? But because of how harshly these people were treated and the diseases that were these people, the population was decimated, right? And then so they started bringing in Scottish and Irish laborers to work on the plantations. They couldn't manage the heat. That's one excuse that is generally given. But also they were pretty expensive, right? They were pretty expensive to get these type of laborers and to do the large scale agricultural production that was needed to become profitable in that region. So they realized that the Portuguese had this business that they started with the slave trade. The Portuguese that started it. And they realized that they could get probably 10 Africans or more for the cost of one white indentured servant, right? And so it was very much an economic decision. It was driven by economics and not just about a feeling of blacks being inferior. Because at that time, many people in Europe would have known about many of the African kingdoms that were still in existence, right? Whether it's Ghana or Mali Empire, mind you, some of them were on the decline at that time, but they would have heard about Mansa Musa, who is known as the richest man to have ever lived, right? They would have heard this and they would have known of this. So they know that Africa is not a place where people are just running around, and practicing cannibalism and all the other, misconstrued lies that are often depicted of ancient Africa. So it was very much driven by economics. I still think that the racism that exists today is primarily driven by economics. If you look in certain situations where a person who is racist or who tends to be racist, their position will change whether or not they're interacting with somebody who has money or not, right? If it's a rich black guy, then okay, maybe I'm cool with this person, right? I look at this person differently. He's not like the others, right? There's always that line that creeps into people who look at racism through the lens of economics.
Right. No, I definitely agree with you. Like, for example, even when people first came into America, I remember how the Caucasian man without property was almost the same as, you know, the slave. Indentured servitude and slavery were very similar, except a slave had ownership over a slave, whereas an indentured servant, you know, got to go back. So I definitely think that. But how do you think that the economics of this like still persist? How can they still, like, we see this through Black voter suppression, things like that, you know? So how are they still, when now Black people have accessibility to education, to everything, almost everything, you know, that the white man has or like others have? So why do you think it still persists, or what are the systems in place that lead it to persist in our society today?
Well, I think we have to look at the fact that racism today exists because it's systematic, right? It's a part of the system. It has been ingrained into the system, right? So when you look at the fact that, especially in America, if we're talking about the American experience, right? If you look at the fact that white families over the years have been able to build up this generational wealth, right? He built up this generational wealth over time, right? Where they're still able to use that advantage to access the best schools, right? To access better jobs, right? And there's also many issues or many evidence that, you know, there's been a research that was done fairly recently where a number of resumes with the same qualifications were sent out for this, the same job, right? And all the applicants had very similar qualifications. But what they realized was that the people who had Black sounding names, right, almost over 50% of those resumes were pretty much put aside because of the name, right? So, you know, there is many evidence that shows that racism is still, as I said, very deeply ingrained into the system. So it's not just about having access to education. It's about having access to capital. It's about having access to property, right? And as we said, for generations, Black Americans have been denied that opportunity to build up that generational wealth over time. And we also see how the relationship between Blacks and police officers in the States, you know, and we also see the racial dimension that takes as well, right? So, you know, a lot of racism is that a lot of the things that affects how racism is treated today is also those internalized biases, right? That people don't even feel like they're racist, but when you look at their behavior, it's hard to dismiss the fact that yes, your behavior is very much racist and hurtful to others.
Right. So before we take this question by Isa FR, I just want to go off of something you said and ask you a question. So how do you think the Black community can act to like stop this? Do you think they need to be contacting their representatives, or like, you know, really like, you know, participating in all votes on all levels? Like, how do you think minorities can act to help the Black community even?
So this is a question that has been asked in different ways repeatedly over time. But I think the Black or the African descendant community have been pretty patient, you know, over the number of years, you know, and have, you know, advocated tirelessly, not just for themselves, but for other minorities as well. Because I think what a lot of people don't realize is that when you look at the struggle that primarily, if you're talking about America, Black Americans have experienced and the battles that they have won, it hasn't just been to the benefit of Black people. Right? When you look at the Civil Rights Act, that strengthened the position not just of Blacks but of all other minorities. And so I think a lot of minority communities need to realize that a lot of the benefits that they're able to enjoy today is on the backs of the sacrifices that have been made by Blacks, and that is something that needs to be acknowledged, and something that, as I said, minority communities need to use to now support the call that Black Americans are making, and other Black people across the world are making, that we are given our full humanity, right? We've been patient. We're not, Black people are not seeking revenge, right? We're not looking for revenge. We're looking to be treated fairly and equally, and that's what it is, and I think in terms of finding a solution to this, I think we often put too much expectation on those who are being oppressed and less on those who are doing the oppressing. And I think if things are going to change meaningfully, it needs to come from those who hold the power.
Right. I completely agree with you. Okay, so the question is, do you feel that modern racism in the West can be attributed to a lack of global and quality education? And by modern racism, I think they mean systematic racism and like implicit biases within people.
Yeah, and if you look at what people like Marcus Garvey, people like Malcolm X, even Dr. King, stated, or what they came to realize over time was that the Black American experience is inherently tied to the African experience, right? Until Africa is allowed to once again assume its role on the world stage, right, which it previously did in the ancient world, then it's hard for me to see racism being finally dealt a death blow, right? I think a lot of people attribute certain inferiority complexes towards Black people because they look at Africa and they look at the state that Africa exists in, and they often use that as a means to justify their feelings towards Black people, right? Without looking into what is contributing to Africa being the way that it is, right? They don't look at how colonialism worked, and they don't look at how neocolonialism is still working to undermine African countries and to undermine African independence. So I think that if people would take time to truly look into the politics of the region more purposefully, more intentionally, and not just from a European perspective, then they would understand a bit better why racism continues to persist. But I do agree with the notion that the racism that persists today is inherently tied to how people view Africa.
Right. I think that's really important. I personally am from Pakistan, so my education, I do think, is from a global perspective. And in that view, I have noticed in America that information is very polarized. It's either Black or white, and you don't, it's all about, because there's so many internal problems within America, I feel like they don't have time to look outside of themselves. They're in this bubble. So I definitely think so. There's another question. What are the origins of racism in your opinion? I think we talked about that. We talked about how the economics of it and just, we talked about that. Do you want to gloss over that again?
Oh, yeah, I'll try to be quick. So my own theory from my own readings is you look at the fact, as I said, ancient Africa was the center of human civilization. It's the birthplace of human civilization, right? What the ancient Egyptians or the ancient Nubians were able to do at the time when they did it is just phenomenal. But what happened over time was, if you look at how Africa is situated, especially Northern Africa, it leaves easy access for continuous invasions, right? And I think because of how early Africa was able to develop its civilization, I think that bred, from an historical perspective, a lot of animosity and also invited a lot of enemies. And I think, if you look back over time, how many invasions that Africa has gone through over and over and over and over again. And even now, I would say that in many ways, the countries of Africa are still subservient in some way or another, even though they're politically independent to the interests of the Western powers. But if you look at how France handles its relationship with the former Francophone countries, it's absurd, right? You look at the fact that I can't remember the exact percent of the reserves of this country that is still being deposited into the French National Bank. When you have such power over a country's economy, then you are still able to call the shots. So I think, going back to the question, that there are some historical issues, as I said, looking back at how ancient Africa developed, the enemies that Africa made very early on, and the fact that Africa was just continuously invaded over and over again. And when slavery developed, I think that created the notion that blackness, I think a lot of people start associating blackness with slavery without recognizing that at some point, almost every other culture has had itself being enslaved in one way or another. But I think more than anything else, more than that historical perspective, the reason why we have racism is mostly and primarily due to the economics of it, right? I think people look at Africa as being poor. People look at Africa generally as being backward. And so they're looking at it from an economic angle, right? When you look at how people view Europe or America, right? It's not just whiteness that they are praising. They're praising Europe or America because they view them as being economically developed, right? And so there's a huge economic factor that plays into people's psychology about racism.
Yeah, but I also feel like just whiteness is almost, we're conditioned to believe it's equated with success. Because I personally, like, you research your African heritage, I've done a lot on the Indian subcontinent because that is where I'm from. And historically, when the British did colonize us, there was a distinct conditioning to believe that fairer skin was superior or more beautiful and more successful, and that not only made us hate our own people, but there was colorism. There's colorism that still exists within our society, but there's also a significant population called the Shidi people, who are actual Africans who were brought into the Indian subcontinent through the slave trade, who also face racism in our country. So I definitely think, and like you talked about the Civil Rights Act, I don't think enough South Asians know the fact that they're here right now, and they're, the fact that they're American citizens right now is because of the Civil Rights Act that gave passage to where they are right now. So I really want to talk about how South Asians can help, Black minorities. I know you said that obviously we need to start working in higher places, but I do feel like the hierarchy oppresses us in such a way and just assumes that we are ignorant and we're not going to do our research. So how do we overcome that as with the South Asian community? How do you think we can help the Black community and other communities do that?
Yeah, I think one has to really personally come to a realization that humans are inherently equal. I think we all have to really truly believe that before we can actually make any steps towards ridding ourselves of any racist feelings that has been inculcated into us over many, many years, right? Racism is something that is taught from very early on, and we see that in children. Right, I don't know if you're familiar with this experiment where they were showing little children in the US, black dolls, white dolls.
Right, I've seen it.
What is the ugly doll? And everybody would point to the black doll. What is the good doll? Everybody would point to the white doll. Which doll is the criminal? Which doll is ugly? You know, and so we realize that racism is something that is taught at a very, very, very early age. Right? So I think we have to actually come to a realization ourselves and realize that whether I'm black, whether I'm brown, whether I'm Chinese or Asian or whatever ethnicity or nationality, you know, because racism is such a confusing term. And race is such a confusing term, you know, especially, you know, in a world that is as mixed as ours. You know, it's very, very confusing. But I think until we accept that everybody is inherently equal, then it's going to be hard for us to come to whatever realization that we need to in order to overcome our racist tendencies. Because if I continue to believe that somehow black people are inferior, brown people are inferior, I can find information to back that belief up. Right? So that's what you see continuously when people are making racist arguments. They can misconstrue and present data and information in a way to really support their point if they need to. And we're seeing statistics being used time and time again, you know, to do that without really looking at the underlying factors that contributes to those statistics. So a lot of people like to look at the fact that black people are disproportionately represented in the prison system in America. Why is that? Well, we need to ask, the deeper question. It's not just because black people like rap music, right? Rap music is the most popular form of music form in the world right now. It's not just black people that are consuming it, right? White people consume it even more than black people, right? So we have to look at the socioeconomic factors that contribute to racism. As I said, from my understanding, looking at racism is primarily an economic condition. It's a condition that is driven by economics. And you had made a point earlier that talked about the relationship between poor whites, right, when the colonies were being formed, and poor blacks. That's even before slavery was institutionalized, right? And how they actually work together, right, against the landowning interests, right? They saw that their common foe was the people in power, right? And when power realized that, we have a serious problem here when poor whites and poor blacks are teaming up against us, so we need to cause a division, right? And so they didn't work necessarily to improve the plight of poor whites, but they made poor whites slightly a little better on an economic ladder than blacks were. Right? And so just to create that buffer zone, right, to let these people fight amongst themselves while we continue to, take a disproportionate portion of the economic pie, right? And I think that's where a lot of the ugliness, from racism comes in, whether it's anti-black racism, whether it's anti-brown racism, anti-yellow or Asian or Mongoloid racism, a lot of it is driven primarily by economics. Because let's look at it. If we look at what black people in America has been able to achieve, even after 400 years, of oppression, right? If you look culturally, I think Barack Obama said it best. Black culture is American culture. If you look at what is being, packaged up, rebrand, and sold to the rest of the world, it is black culture, right? If you look at all the music forms within America or even throughout the world, the contributions that Black people have made are endless. If you look not just in arts, but even in the fields of science, right? And as I said, a lot of these histories are purposefully neglected, right? Because they would work towards dispelling the myth of racism that has been perpetuated for such a long time.
Right. There's someone talking about Muslim discrimination over here. I just want to clarify that today's episode is about racism and specifically about the racism that the Black community faces. So I want this to be a platform today for that, and we can discuss Muslim discrimination at another time, and that plight is also important. And before I go to the question that was asked, I just wanted to talk about there's, not to sound disrespectful, but in South Asians, there's a prevalent perception, especially in the older generations, when you talked about the economics, especially, that Black people are lazy and they live on welfare, especially in America, right? It is very prevalent. And I feel like, especially for younger South Asians, even though it's a very uncomfortable talk to have, it definitely needs to be, like you said, like educate yourself on Black history. I feel like to younger South Asians and even older ones, middle-aged ones, like definitely have that talk to your parents about the fact that that is not true. That is just that is a very misconstrued and manipulated image that's put on media, that we all believe that narrative and that stands on that. So I think definitely that. And I also think that there's a model minority myth that's in place, which makes Asians believe that if you just work hard, you will do well. And it's because that the Black community doesn't work hard and doesn't strive. That's why they're in the position that they're in. And I feel like South Asians need to understand that there are systems in place to make us believe that. And that is in fact not true. So definitely have that uncomfortable conversation and educate yourselves. So there's another question by Fezu Tube. Are other colored communities as badly affected with racism, or does the intensity increase when it comes to the Black community? I think they're talking about mostly in North America, in Europe, when they say that.
It's a very good question. It's a very important question. And I would, off the top of my head, say yes. And the reason why I would initially say yes is because throughout the different countries that I've lived in, and from what I've read and what I've seen, there's a lot of anti-Blackness in pretty much all the societies across the globe. Whether it's Chinese, whether it's the Indian society, whether it's white society, there's a strong anti-Blackness sentiment that is found throughout those communities. And as I said, a lot of it, as you just pointed out, is based on those myths, that have persisted. To call Black people lazy is pretty lazy, intellectually lazy, right? If you want to call Black people lazy, you really have to catch up on your reading, because America is nothing without the work and the labor that Black people put in to build that country, right? It's nothing without, and it's still nothing without the continued efforts that Black people make to keep America the way that it is, right? Because as I said, culturally, the things that that America like to sell abroad, if you look at the contributions that Blacks have made to that, it's profound, right? A lot of people look at America positively because of the changes, or some of the changes that came in, as I said, as we mentioned earlier, with the Civil Rights Act, right? That's work was primarily done by Black people, right? And that's something that has to be acknowledged. And I said it needs to be understood. And once it's understood, I don't think people who hold that notion that somehow Black people are lazy can continue to do so. When you look at what poor Black people have been able to accomplish, with minimum wage jobs, in underserved communities, right? In communities with poor schools, horrible schools, right? And what they've still been able to accomplish, and how dominant they have been able to be in certain sectors that have been open to them. I think the argument really dies a quick death that Black people are lazy. Like, the reason why Black people have been so successful in, let's say, arts and sports, it's not because they can't be as successful in science or in business, but it's because those fields were primarily open to them before the other fields were open, right? People have always, a lot of people who have always hated Black people have always loved Black music. If you go back to the 60s, a lot of the prominent white musicians were singing Black music. White people who hated Black people were dancing to Black music. And it's still happening today, right? So, a lot of people who are racist still watch basketball, right? The effort that it takes to become a professional athlete. If one is able to put that effort into any other field, then that person will be just as successful,
Right.
or even more successful, right? Because I think less than 1% of humanity will become professional athletes because of the tireless effort that it takes.
Right.
So as I said, racism is a bunch of hogwash, and if you look at it from any angle, that's really what it comes down to, But if people want to spend time believing that somehow they're superior, they'll find anything to believe. Any little information that is found, they will package it and believe it. But until we are able to come to a realization in our own selves that we are all inherently equal, regardless of our religion, regardless of our beliefs, regardless of our complexion, then then we will still have racism in some form.
Right. Before I let you have the last word, I just wanted to say that it's really important. Like you said, racism in its entirety is so irrational. And I think we need to stop letting those in power and the hierarchy fool us into believing these lies and letting people control us, And the fact, especially to the South Asian society, because I know most of our audience right now is South Asian. For your ignorance, for like, your lack of education, go do that. Recognize your implicit biases, and it's fine to feel uncomfortable as long as you're improving yourself and progressing. No one is going to cancel you or call you out as long as you're improving. And go support Black businesses. Promote when you listen to Black music. Share it on your Instagram. Do that. Like, give Black people a platform and do everything you can. It doesn't necessarily have to be monetarily. You can support the Black community in a lot of different ways, I feel like, too. And yeah, just that, be kinder to people. We're, like you said, we're all inherently good and we're all inherently equal. So just that on my part, it's all on you now.
Yeah. So once again, thanks so much for giving me this opportunity to speak on this very important topic, a topic that is getting a lot more attention these days, but it should have been getting attention for a much longer time, and it's still not getting the attention that I think it truly deserves. But it's either we come to a realization that we're all in this together, or we continue to move down a path that is pretty much guaranteed that we're going to self-destruct. And I'm hoping that that is not where we end up, and that we'll come to realize that, we can live a much more happy, a much happier, a much more fruitful, prosperous life, if we all work together. And we need to stop this endless competition about which one of us is better, which one of us is the best. It's a really useless endeavor. There is so much beauty to be experienced in life if we just realize that we are all coming from the same place and we are all going to the same place, because whatever we
Right.
believe in this life, two things are promised to us. That's, once we are born, we will die, and we will die within an unspecified period of time. And so while we have life, I think we owe it to ourselves to be a little more gentle, a little kinder, and to understand that we're all one. And so, wake up every day and question anything that is leading you to believe that somehow your complexion makes you, or your culture makes you, or your religion makes you superior to others. You need to question that. You need to question that every day, right?
Right.
I didn't come to where I am at now, in my thinking, without asking myself those difficult questions. Even about my religion, right? I had to ask myself some very tough questions, and to realize that, I need to remove myself from any thoughts that would put me above any other human being. Because once I can think that I'm better than someone, then I am contributing to the dehumanization of somebody else. Once I see someone else as less than, then that's how it starts. It starts with those small dehumanization that, my culture is better because I use fork and that person uses chopstick, or that person uses their hand to eat, right? The food is going into your body and it's doing what it needs to do, regardless of how it gets there, right? Our cultures are shaped by our surroundings and by our historical experiences. It doesn't make better than the other. And once we come to that realization, then we are going to be able to cast off racism and treat it for what it is. But
Right.
until we are able to do that, then we're going to have a real tough time dealing with it. And, you mentioned the support that is needed. A lot of support is needed. I saw someone wrote a question about the anxiety that comes with racism. And I think that's an important question to ask. Is the relationship is very strong, because I remember, some of the times when I watch these videos of Black people being mistreated, being killed by police officers, or some other form of racism, I feel like I'm being re-traumatized every time I have to witness something like this. And, it can put you into a very dark place. Those feelings can put you into a very dark place. And so, yes, there's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety with coming to seeing how people are treated that look like you because of their complexion. It really does a lot to disrupt and destroy your mental health. So we all have a role to play to be kinder, more gentler with each other. And as Bob Marley reminded us in his song, one love, one heart, let's and feel all right. And
Right.
thanks again for really having me. I appreciate it.
Right. Yeah, it's tragic that we still have to, that the Black community still has to experience this reality. Like we look at it from an outside perspective, but this is an actual reality for people. And it just shows us we've not done our part as a community. But now is the time. We can still do things now. So get to that, I guess.
Get to that. I think it was Dr. King who reminded us that about the fierce urgency of now. Like, regardless of what happened in the past, we have the now to correct those things. We have the now to make things right. And it's all of our responsibilities, not just those in power, right? We like this day and age to point all our fingers at Trump, but Trump is the product of a history that's long. He's also the product of I think 50 million people that voted for him, right? So it's not just him, and it won't change once he is gone, because it was there before he was in office. So we all have to realize that we have an important role to play in combating racism and all other forms of discrimination to begin with.
Right. The bill that just came out in response to the protests, the Republicans' clause that they added to it was moderate deliberation, right?
Mhm.
Which means to do it slowly, right? To enact
Mhm.
laws slowly.
Mhm.
And I feel like a radical change is needed and it needs to happen now. And yeah, just go for it.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us, Jermaine. Thank you for joining us today. I learned a
Thank
lot
you.
today. And I'm sure people who were exposed to your perspective, to your experiences, also learned a lot. Just thank you for being here.
Thank you
And
for having me.
thank you.
No, I
So
appreciate it.
okay. So I guess this is the end of our show. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you for commenting. Thank you for contributing to the discussion. And yeah, this is Ensiyah with Social Chai. We'll be bringing in new episodes every Sunday, same time. So stay tuned in and bye.